Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Hello, my name is Joe Wilson Jr. I am in my 15th season as a member of the resident acting company at Trinity Rep, and I am also the coordinator for Activism through Performance at Trinity Rep. It is such a pleasure to be here with you to kick off this conference, and I have to be brutally honest with you that whenever I'm in front of a group of smart people like you, I get a little bit of imposter syndrome. Especially when, Saul came to me and said, "Hey, Joe, let's collaborate and talk about wellness and healthcare." And I'm like, I don't know a damn thing about wellness and healthcare. I've always been a young guy. I sometimes have had insurance. Of course, since I've been at Trinity Rep and I work a certain amount of weeks a year, I've been consistent with my insurance and I have dental coverage, but really nothing had ever struck me or my family that made me think about healthcare or wellness in this kind of real way. From a family of privilege, from a family of education. But I want to start today by, I think, hopefully giving us a charge as we proceed forward in listening to all of these stories. A few months ago, I was struck at a conference that I attended. It was more like a breakfast, convening a summit that was sponsored by the Providence After School Alliance, which is a wonderful organization here in Providence that provides programming for young people, specifically youth, in our urban center of Providence, after-school programming, and a lot of that programming is rooted in the humanities. And this breakfast was a celebration of the artists and community activists and teachers who all come together using the humanities as a way to guide and to shape our young people and provide them with services and activities after their normal school hours. And I was struck by a question that was posed. And that question that was posed to the panelists were about identifying those moments when we were raptured, when we got the theater bug, those moments when we first knew that we wanted to be an artist. And what I discovered, and I'm going to try and weave all this together as best I can because I have a lot to say this morning. I always have a lot to say this morning, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I was struck by that, especially in the world that we're living in now where we're fighting over what's really the facts. We can't even agree upon a common narrative. At that breakfast, I was struck by the fact that I discovered that the lie that I had been telling about my own origin story, this is the lie. My origin story originally that I would tell about my becoming involved in the arts was my time in attending the University of Notre Dame. Go Irish. I had planned on going to law school. Every class I took, everything I did was about going to law school, getting into law school, and then hopefully someday running to be the governor of Louisiana. When I was at Notre Dame, I took all my political science courses. I served in the Student Senate. I helped put forth bills to honor National Coming Out Day at a Catholic institution, which was voted down. I was involved in the NAACP clubs on campus. I was involved in all kinds of student organizations, very active and involved, paving that way for me to go on to law school and to run for office. Now, what happened at Notre Dame was that there was a group of us, a group of students of color, present students and students of color who remained in South Bend to work, and we would get together every Saturday night and we would make a jambalaya dinner. Actually, I would make the jambalaya being from New Orleans. And we would sit and drink wine and talk. And out of these conversations, we talked about why weren't faculty of color being recruited actively on that campus? Why was it that a black student could show up on campus in their freshman year, and by their senior year, they couldn't afford to be at the institution? Why is it that this environment on our campus still seemed to be so hostile to students of color? Why were students of color having such a difficult time finding their way, embedding themselves into the life of this spiritual institution? So to make a long story short, we began to, on our cocktail napkins or on pieces of loose leaf paper, draw up a list of demands about how we envisioned a better Notre Dame, how we envisioned a more inclusive Notre Dame. So out of our jambalaya Saturdays, we, in essence, developed a manifesto. To make a long story short, that group of students one day shut down the Golden Dome. We sat in, and we shut that building down for an entire day, surrounded not just by students of color, average students of color. I say average students of color because we were also accompanied by members of the Fighting Irish football team. So it was not just students, but student athletes. And we sat in that building 500 strong for a day. Now, eventually, they called our parents and said, get your kids out of this building or we're going to kick them out of Notre Dame. But I am proud to say that the result of our efforts that day, my brother went to Notre Dame 10 years later. And many of the initiatives that we drew up over drunken jambalaya dinners are still policy at Notre Dame to this day. We have an Office of Cultural Affairs at Notre Dame. That's a direct result of one of those demands on our list. Our faculty of color at Notre Dame's campus has doubled since I was there. The retention of students of color at Notre Dame is almost 100%. That is so different than when I was there. So much has changed. So because of that sit-in and because of all that drama, I got so frustrated and I was tired and I was, because at the time these things didn't happen right away. I was so tired and discouraged and exhausted, I dropped out of everything political. Because I knew I was going to law school. I'd already been accepted into 5 law schools. That was my junior year of college. So I dropped out of all that political stuff that I was just simply doing to get into law school and increase my CV, so to speak. And I took an acting class. And that acting class changed my life. Long story short, I didn't go to law school. I went to the University of Minnesota and got my master's in fine arts, specializing in acting. As my origin story, that's a lie. That's a lie. At that Providence After School Alliance breakfast, I realized that my real origin story was back in high school. Growing up a kid who knew he was gay, but wasn't quite out. Growing up in a very religious environment, my dad being a United Methodist minister, I went to an all-black male Catholic high school. The same high school that my father went to. The same high school that his brothers went to. And what I realized, and it was hidden because of my own trauma, it was hidden because of the own fog that I was moving through the world in. My origin story started then when I was in speech and debate. And we would travel around the state and do all these forensic competitions, dramatic readings and extemporaneous speaking and poetry readings. My origin story of falling in love with what is transformative about what I do was the fact that I was at this all-black male Catholic high school, and it was the first time experiencing being in a completely non-toxic masculine environment with these young black men. It didn't matter who we were. It didn't matter what we looked like. We all came together for the purpose of telling stories. That was my origin story. But I couldn't see that for a long time because of trauma. That had to be unearthed, and that is indeed a process. So my first lesson to us today is to remember that we need to keep digging for the truth. And what we think is the beginning, the start of that thing that inspires us, may not be that very thing. And in realizing that truth, seeing that truth, we then give the full weight and full blessings and full grace and full thankfulness to those places and spaces that we once feared, that we once rejected, those spaces that we ran from, those spaces that we did not want to be a part of. Which leads me to the second part of my story this morning. As you all know from last night, and I have been talking about him quite a bit, when Saul first came to me to help to do America 2 in conjunction with this discussion around wellness, my eyes glazed over because I know absolutely nothing about healthcare until it's time to go to the dentist, or until something hurts, or until I have a hangnail, or until I break my knee, which I've done before. And so I was a little apprehensive about getting involved in something that seemed so technical and technocratic and away from me. But I agreed because I love Saul, and I agreed because I love telling stories, and I agreed because I have always had this inquisitive nature about me. I love to inquire and ask questions. But what was interesting in this inquiry, in the initial impulse to be involved, it was just me inquiring and asking and becoming smarter and more knowledgeable, but I quickly became the subject of my own inquiry. As we were planning this summit, and I mentioned this last night, I was leaving Providence at the end of our season. I went to New York to participate in the Stonewall 50 commemoration at Queen's Theater with the One Minute Play Festival, and I came home to get my dog Stella to then go off to Chatham and celebrate July 4th. We had been there one night before I received a phone call from my mother saying that my father was suffering from a series of seizures. I flew into Houston. I'm from New Orleans originally, but flew into Houston because that's my parents relocated after Katrina. And over the course of 47 days, what started off as seizures turned into stage 4 brain cancer, and my father passed on August 10th. And what started off with this project of trying to gather information about what's messed up about our healthcare system, I suddenly found myself in the midst of battling and dealing with what was truly a messed up healthcare system. As I've mentioned, I'm a man who has come from means and privilege. Being in New Orleans, I was fortunately educated. Being in New Orleans, of course, my skin color has always afforded me privilege, being, as we used to say down there, a high yellow Creole man. There's so many access points to privilege that I have in my life, and suddenly my mother and I, my family, felt powerless. And so my second lesson to you today is that we cannot look at these stories and look at this summit and look at this work in the abstract. That whether you understand health and wellness from the outside or you've had challenges in your own lives, that these aren't abstract concepts. That these, what you will be discussing over the next 2 days, will be life-saving practices. And that should be the focus of this conference, is that we're looking to create practice out of these stories that we hear. And that's a lesson I've also learned in terms of my own work, my own acting. Of course, I came to this profession late. And so when I told my parents, I'm not going to law school and I want to be an actor, they were like, are you out of your damn mind? Because their perspective about acting and about the humanities, it's something you can afford to do or not to do. It's something you can make a choice to say, do I want to go to the movies or do I want to feed my family? Do I want to go to a play or do I want to buy a tank of gas? There was no understanding. We didn't have a relationship with this art form other than it being a luxury item and not a thing that can truly transform communities. That acting and the humanities is about practice. It's not expendable. It's not a thing that we can choose to look at, to admire at a distance, and then we leave it. That this thing that I do every single day it's real. And there are real life consequences to telling people stories. You know, the other night, one of the stories that we heard, the woman and her son, she leaned over to me as she heard her story because she had no idea that I had put her story in the show. And she leaned her head on my shoulder and she began to sob. And she said, thank you for telling my story. Thank you for telling my story. So storytelling is real, it's important, and it's important. I would like to end here with another story. In speaking of origin stories, I have to admit another lie, and that I've always thought that, you know, once I got into this profession, and my first professional job was in 1996, that began my journey as a storyteller. That began my understanding of the power of telling story and the responsibility of telling stories, but that's a lie. I didn't know what I was doing back then. I also sometimes tell my origin story, and loving of telling stories is the beginning of my work with America Too and the activism work that I started 5 years ago at my theater, but that's a lie. I stumbled into this accidentally, and as I tell the story, I told my mother this story for the first time over dinner last night. About 7 years ago, I had the pleasure of doing a show called Boots on the Ground here at Trinity Rep. And that show was a series of interviews by people who had served in Rhode Island in the Iraq War. And I was after rehearsal, and I went out to get a drink at one of my favorite gay bars, the Dark Lady. It was actually the Alley Cat. And I was sitting at a bar having a drink. And this gentleman was sitting next to me, and I saw that he was wearing patches on a jacket that he appeared to be a service member. And I'm like, oh my God, well, I'm doing a play about service people. I can just ask him some questions. And we talked. And finally, I looked at this gentleman in his eye as we're sitting at this bar by the door, with our backs to the door. And I said, what was it like? And me, being inquisitive and being naive and asking questions. And I think there was a certain trivial nature about, oh, this is really cool. I'm talking to a soldier and I'm playing a soldier. I asked him the fateful question, what was it like over there? And he looked me dead in my eyes because he saw me see him for the first time. And he was begging me to see him for the first time. And not to be just a subject or a bone collector as an artist, but to see him. And he wanted to let me know what it was like over there. And he pulled out a knife about this long, and he held it up to my throat with my back against the wall by the door. And he looked me dead in my eyes as I held his hand, and he said, "You want to know what it was like? This is what it was like. This is what it was like." And while everyone sitting at the bar was scared to death, I felt calm and at peace because I knew he wouldn't hurt me because he saw me see him. He saw me see him, and he appreciated me seeing him, and he wanted me to know how he felt. That's what it was like over there. Long story short, I kept calm, the police were called, and before I knew it, the door flew open, guns were drawn, the guy dropped the knife, and they took him off. But I'll never forget that story, because from that point on, my relationship to my art form changed, in that the stories that I tell are real. The consequences are real. And we have to give them the weight and justice that they deserve. This is not a passive exercise of just people sitting in a room and wearing lanyards and having cute conversations about policy. That the stakes are real. And in a time in history when we can't even agree what the facts are, when we can't even agree what the narrative is, when we can't even understand why using lynching in the context of a political speech is wrong, we have a long way to go. Our words matter, our stories matter, our histories matter. We're not just telling them as a passive exercise, we're telling them as a way to see each other better, to hear each other better, to love each other better, and to forever be committed to making this world a better place, a more human place. Thank you for listening. Thank you for having me. Thank you, thank you, thank you.